This is the Forgecast, your eye into the who's who and what's what in cybersecurity and the cloud. Each episode, we bring you fresh perspectives, personal stories, insights, and advice from leaders, innovators, and change makers forging a stronger future.
Welcome to the Forgecast. I'm your host, Ernie. I'm pleased to have with me my good friend, co-founder and CEO of Huntress Labs, Kyle Hanslovan. Kyle, welcome.
Yo, Ernie, I appreciate you having me.
Well, for those that don't know, Kyle spent a pretty decent amount of time in the U.S. Air Force, in the Air National Guard, and within the intelligence community, doing both defensive and offensive cyber operations. And then one day he decided, 8-9 years ago, he was going to start a company. And here we are today. So why don't we jump right in? I have a lot of questions. We have a lot to talk about here. So Kyle, let's start from that 17-year-old kid joining the Air Force, enlisting in the Air Force. What was going through your mind, and how did that transition into being a cyber operator?
Yeah, don't pick on me too hard, Ernie, but I had opportunities. I was going to go. I did Navy Junior ROTC. I had plans and expectations to go to the Naval Academy. And then on my 17th birthday, I was like, I am getting in way too much trouble. I just need to get out of Dodge, and I enlisted. So ended up in the Air Force. And if you think about that time frame of early 2000s, the word cyber wasn't really, that was like something you did in a chat room, kind of dirty. It definitely didn't mean what it means now. But what was nice is that coming in right at that cusp, my initial jobs kind of got to build on some of the early AOL hacking skills that I kind of had, and pivoted into some of the very first cyber warfare operations on the Air Force side. So it's kind of about right place, right time.
Excellent. So once you were deep into your career as an offensive operator, describe to the audience, what is it, there's this mystique you see in movies and everything. What was it like being an offensive, essentially a nation state hacker? Did you have this, was it a glamorous job, or were you in this dark room by yourself with 5 screens in front of you?
Yeah, so what's funny about this is all the Hollywood stuff that makes it so sexy and so quick is probably about the exact opposite of what it's like to actually sit at the nation state level. So you're in a room. It's a skiff for those people who have never been in the classified world. That means secure, compartmented information facility, or another word to say it is no phones, no digital watches, no access to all the fun things that make you good. And yeah, we might have had, 3 or 4 monitors at any one time, but it's kind of a lonely job. But most of that time is just mastering the basics, learning how to get into systems quick and efficiently, learning how to clean up behind you. And most importantly, maybe the biggest thing I pulled away from my time supporting offense was your job depended on you delivering valuable outcomes. And what I mean by that is if you messed up your job in the counterterrorism world, you could have somebody that loses their life. And in the foreign intelligence world, if you didn't get our, congressmen or women the actual intel they needed, we weren't able to make kind of the big national security decisions we needed to kind of, I would say, play at the world stage. So for me, that kind of was one of those things that only now, looking back, 8 years ago, did I realize that all of that work and kind of the expectation of delivering valuable outcomes kind of was paving the way for future success.
Interesting. On that same note, when we were looking to invest in Huntress, we both have similar overlap in our networks. And, one of the things I heard from former commanders and colleagues of yours was this guy demonstrated leadership early on. As an airman, you had teams dispersed around the world, remote, if you will. How did those leadership lessons and abilities translate into being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it turns out since you have to work in small compartmented teams that are geographically separated, that's how most of NSA operations worked at that time. It got really familiar with you really have to be a master in your role. You have to truly be able to own that role. but it also taught you to work asynchronously, meaning you didn't all have to be on the clock or on the webcam, or VTC, video teleconference is what we called it, at the same time. And oddly enough, like back in 2015 when we founded the company, and I remember when we started meeting each other a couple years later, I mentioned our team was fully remote, and we didn't all work in one office, that we actually were, geographically separated before COVID even happened. And it turned out that really gave us a leg up on being able to hire really the truly top talent, not just the talent that's in your local area. It had extra complexities. We pay taxes in like 40 plus states now, but I would say that single, like small difference of like learning to work asynchronously with experts really kind of helped set us on a trajectory that allowed us to quickly go where most startups don't get to achieve.
It's interesting because when we invested, you had 19 people fully remote, and that was an outlier for startups. And we closed the Series A at RSA February 2020, and we went into lockdown 2 weeks later. And all of a sudden, everyone was remote. So you guys were just thinking well ahead of the game. And at this point, you have 300 people plus, and there's one public company I know that's still fully remote, GitLab, that has over 2,000. So I'm jumping ahead here because I was going to talk about this later. But for you, what are some of the challenges being fully remote? You mentioned some of the pros just now, and do you see Huntress staying fully remote into the future?
Yeah, so you nailed it. We were, call it ahead of the curve, coming before COVID. I remember actually one of the Series A term sheets. I won't say the fund, but I remember him saying, if we don't headquarter in Baltimore and centralize everybody, there wouldn't be a term sheet opportunity for us, which you could imagine. Post-COVID, I did one of the, a polite call, follow up and just said, hey, what's your thoughts on remote world? And obviously we both got a good laugh out of it. None of us could have seen this coming. But you're right. It's not all gravy, right? To be honest, you have to be very, very, I would call it deliberate if you decide to work fully remote. And what I mean by that is I personally believe you can have fully in the office or fully remote. I see breakdowns happen when someone loses their identity and tries to do a hybrid model. And what I mean by that is usually if you're predominantly physical, the people in the office get all the water cooler talk, etc. And the opposite, if you're predominantly remote and those couple people together, you sometimes leave out the people that, you're not as deliberate, meaning you're communicating to everybody. And sometimes the people that are actually on site can get left out. And so for us, that whole, there is no headquarters. We might have a place where we store and, hardware and have, mail sent to, but that's given us both, some really hard lessons to learn, right? We weren't always this deliberate. And what I mean by that is communicating efficiently on Slack. Your physical location is the virtual world. So for us, Zoom and Slack are really important in that. And I kind of alluded to it earlier, like even just having, for sales tax purposes, having 40 different nexus that you now have to do independent sales tax, like it's not for the faint of heart. So while many people say, oh, you're benefiting because you don't have an office to pay for. I mean, Ernie, you know it firsthand, but for the audience, we have to take every dime that we would spend on somebody in the office and reinvest it into purposeful gatherings to all bring us together a couple times a year, but also to pay for that extra overhead that comes with being in so many different states.
Yep, absolutely. So let's, there's probably folks currently serving in the government, whether DoD, intelligence community, you name it, and with veterans that have left the military trying to decide what to do. What made you leave that world, that lifestyle, and jump right into founding from T0 a cybersecurity startup?
So there's probably some level of foolishness, right? Of like, I wanted to do better and I might not have realized how hard it was going to be. But to be on a scale was my number one. I thought I could make a bigger difference. And I thought about it. I had played with the services work, contracting back to the government, kind of one body at a time. But I realized if I was going to make the kind of global change. And for us, it was all about protecting most of the companies that are ignored, right? Think about those small and mid-sized businesses that will never be considered a Fortune 500, right? They're probably not even Fortune 5,000. And what I had to decide is if I was going to reach that many businesses, right? 30 million plus in the US alone, I was going to have to use software. I was going to have to build a SaaS model. And for me, that's very different than the government, right? That was one off. But the one thing I learned at NSA, again, if you see these like threads coming together, very small compartmented teams, leveraging tons of automation to deliver, I'll avoid curse words, but how about valuable freaking outcomes? And those three things together kind of got me over the hurdle. And I realized that if I could really find a niche that really had a need, that was willing to pay for it, and we could build automation, so all my expertise, but canned in software, we really had an opportunity. And that's, still 8 years plus in the making now, and we're still figuring out how to do it better.
But talk more about that. You talked a little bit about, you alluded to why Huntress was founded, but talk a little bit more about the problem, how you were initially solving, and how that's, I don't want to get too far ahead here, but how you're solving it now.
Yeah. And especially thinking about those early days. My mom has always been my biggest champ, Ernie. Like, she is one of those like moms that just, no matter what, I could probably do something illegal and she'd still be there supporting, right? But she was kind of disappointed after I just had this great career at NSA. I'd spent 13 plus years on that side of the offensive mission. And she was like, wait, you could be supporting like Fortune 10 businesses, Kyle. We won the World Series of hacking. Why aren't you doing that? And my mom is a small business owner. She was like, I'm not important enough. And I had to remind her, Ernie, really early in the beginning that like Walmart doesn't serve the biggest companies in the world, right? But they are the Fortune 1. They're the biggest company in the Fortune 500 because they understand that if you support the small businesses, there's a lot of need there and also a lot of opportunity to build a company of consequence. So again, pulling this thread, as I was telling my mom about this, I was having to explain to her not only was the need and opportunity there, but really I had to figure out crazy hard things, Ernie. Like, I didn't have, like, I'm a hacker. I write code. I spent all my time at NSA. I didn't know go-to-market. I didn't know sales. So maybe the hardest hurdles for me weren't actually the technical ones in building software. They were things like, oh crap, if I'm going to go after this market that nobody else kind of felt was important enough, like, how do I get to them? And that's where you have to like put your technical hat down sometimes and think through like, what is go-to-market? And you heard my earliest pitches. They weren't as crisp as they are now, but I knew I had to have like some method to go from one of me at Huntress to many of these small businesses in between. And our go-to-market used channel partners. And so, for instance, I know that's not the sexy thing that most technical founders want to talk about, but you could build the sexiest, coolest cybersecurity tech or whatever technology. But if you can't bring it to your target audience, you're never going to make the difference you want to, Ernie. So I would actually say of all the things in the beginning, figuring out how to go to market was actually maybe the most challenging for me, especially to convince. And that's one thing that you guys at Forgepoint did. You understood that we were doing something different. You understood the potential. And so if I could give advice to anybody who listens to this, when they find a partner, especially a capital partner, if they don't have belief in that and don't see where your vision is, I'm not saying it has to be blind faith, but I'm talking about that belief to me is what separates capital and actually a true partner. And, obviously this is great that it's a Forgepoint podcast, but, you guys brought that, and that's why we chose you guys.
And we appreciate that. When you go back to the founding, I always think having the right co-founders is super important. You don't want 3 Kyles or 4 Kyles. You want a mix. So with you, Chris and John, how did you think about, because, for future founders listening to this, how did you think about that? What's the right number? What's the right background, technical mix, et cetera?
Yeah. So I have in front of me a handful of startup books, and it's just convenient. One of them starts with why. Another one is good strategy, bad strategy. And if you get a little bit later, this lovely little thing, High Growth Handbook, is pretty neat too. But where I'm going with this is all 3 of these books have a version of saying the single most important thing you do is the team that you build. Specifically, founding is a lot of the early stage. But what I want to give the advice to this like potential founders would be, you just don't realize how much gravity your founding team is going to matter. So for instance, John, Chris, and I had all worked with each other at NSA, but it's only in the last probably year we started realizing why we complemented each other. And so I'm going to give very specific examples. I, for instance, was learning to talk a little bit better than most technical founders, and Chris, because we were both teaching. We were teaching hacking classes at Black Hat. I knew to be a CEO, I would have to present and I would have to articulate like this podcast. What I didn't know is there's different levels of technical presentations. And so, for instance, having Chris that could talk about as my CTO at the technical level and rally engineers and the way that technical people want to be, motivated is very different than me having to learn how to speak financial acumen and speaking how the metrics and KPIs matter. So that is something that we went 7 years not realizing we were complementing each other, but also other personality differences, Ernie. Like I am by default, I am almost probably overly optimistic. Chris rotates heavier on the pessimism side. And for John, he's just methodical and takes his time before he forms any opinion. So what we didn't know was by me being blindly optimistic, chasing, I'm not trying to work on how do we, lose. I'm trying to find all the reasons of why we can win. Chris, though, is always slightly, this is what kills us. This is what's going to take us down. And then you have somebody like John who's coming in and saying, let me help be that tiebreaker. Let me help you figure these out. 3 was the right dynamic. I think that, there are some ways that you could do it in 2. But I sometimes reach entrepreneurs who are like, I'm going to solo found this. And that would be the biggest mistake I think anybody would make. So for us, again, technical skills, business skills, sales skills, all of those have to be represented by your founding team. And then more important, as you scale, you now have to hand these off to your new leaders. And I think that's one thing that I'm going a little long-winded here, but if I could wrap it up succinctly, it would be most founders I meet are unprepared to have all the skills they need just as founders. And I think if people spent more time really thinking that through, they have better chances of succeeding. And like us, we largely got lucky.
That's great advice. When you think back to raising your early rounds, go back to seed Series A, what are some of the trials and tribulations the founding team went through for a security company out of Maryland, no Silicon Valley presence? And people need to think back, a lot has been democratized with talent, with capital. Going back pre-2019, it was a little different. So you guys had a little bit of an uphill battle, just you weren't out here in Silicon Valley. So talk about some of those trials and tribulations and how you overcame them to, today you've raised, 160 million in aggregate, something like that.
Yeah. You throw venture debt on there, probably a little bit more. The audience only listened to the audio version of this, wouldn't know, but I've been head nodding throughout Ernie's entire comment here because I don't think, just how like the way when we have biases or we have privilege, a lot of time you don't realize what you're getting for free. And for instance, I didn't know that starting a company in Maryland where I felt was the cybersecurity capital of the US, NSA is there, Cyber Command's there, DISA, CISA, there's just talent everywhere. I thought we were going to have a very clear story because cybersecurity was already hot in the enterprise in Silicon Valley. But what I didn't realize is if you just don't speak the same, call it twang, right? Accent, jargon. I didn't realize that sometimes I was in the early days, Ernie, pitching things that sounded so much like services that I didn't realize I was turning people off, even though I meant I was going to create this recurring revenue model that was predominantly built on very high margin, repeatable technology with a little bit of human services. Because I used the wrong language, Ernie, a lot of time, especially the further, out of Maryland I got and the closer I got to Silicon Valley, I was turning people off. They just, all they heard, and that's my fault. That's not Silicon Valley's fault or anybody else. Other things, for instance, I didn't think about that with all of my founders coming from this government services NSA world, that if I didn't round out my team, sometimes I was projecting just a group of founders that didn't have the knowledge in SaaS. So sometimes I think, again, my fault for not presenting to match the patterns that fortunately and unfortunately a lot of investors use. And so, yeah, being in Maryland was an uphill battle. Going after the SMB in 2019 was not sexy. But the biggest businesses of the world tend to be built in the Fortune 100 or very, very large B2C businesses. Think of Uber, Airbnb, selling an iPhone from Apple, right? B2C style. And I wasn't either of those. I was a services government founder, 3 of us, that all happened to be outside of Silicon Valley, that didn't speak the right words, that was going after the SMB through channel partner. Like, it was not a winning story. And so if I could share with anybody that, like, the hardest lessons learned is sometimes you need somebody to slap you around and say, your story doesn't make sense. And I probably failed raising seed rounds and Series A conversations. Maybe 30 to 40% of my conversations were just absolute terrible because I did not realize I wasn't speaking jargon. So I'm not sure if that's where you were thinking, Ernie, but I can tell you that was like a terribly hard lesson to learn as a technically competent founder that meant all these things, but I just wasn't saying it right.
Hey, I was on the other side of the table. And so I think by the time we talked, I think you had smoothed out the vision and the talking points. But let's, when I think of startups, there's humans involved. And for folks like you're creating something out of nothing, and it's an emotional roller coaster. You have some days, think back to, year 1 and 2. Some days when you're on top of the world, other days you're like, I should probably just go back to the NSA or do something else. So talk about some of the early milestones where you, Chris, and John were like, I think we have something here. We're getting traction and our vision is actually becoming reality.
I can think of 2 real cases that are very different than the other. I'm a technical founder. I'm going to start with the technical one. I didn't realize how much sex appeal came with coming from places with mystique, right? A lot of Israeli technical founders talk about Unit 8200. A lot of U.S., the word NSA, Cyber Command, CIA is dropped just as often. That's great. But remember, even janitors get employed at NSA, so that doesn't guarantee you success. But what I didn't realize is I needed a place to show my product worked. So when we were early, Ernie, way before we had ever started charging, I took a very, very pre-MVP version of our product, and I was able to use my NSA connections to test my software at the largest offensive cybersecurity exercise, this cyber flag exercise. And I got to test my software across hundreds of systems. And what was neat is at the end of this, I got the feedback loop and I said, well, I'm aware of 36 computers that were compromised. And of those 36 computers of, I don't know, hundreds, they came back and originally said, hey, you have 36 of 36. And I think the number even grew to 63 of 63. But when you have that validation, and it was real, it was tangible. I'd written emails. I had examples of people saying, like, you truly found something that everybody else missed. I didn't realize, but when I was able to get past my terrible pitch and into actually showing proof and saying, I went to an NSA exercise where the world's greatest hackers went against the world's greatest defense. I got to play on both sides, and my technology that was tested here found, again, 36 of 36 at the time, and show that was real. People listened, because even if my pitch, they knew that there was something there. And I would say that if I didn't have that early success, I wouldn't have caught people's eyes or ears. I probably, that gave real credibility. And if you pair that with, I just won DEF CON's Capture the Flag, plus I have access to these places most people don't, and I have some verified credibility, people knew I was onto something, and it might have got me the second meeting. The next one was, there was a gentleman, he was one of those early guys and said, Kyle, your pitch sucks. He actually brought me to tacos in Silicon Valley and just told me it was crap. And on the spot, him and my 3 co-founders reworked my pitch over tacos. And he said, I would have written you a term sheet if you would have told this to me in the first place and pitched my partnership. And I don't know if that was true or not, but the fact that he was giving me that validation, that it was now at the point, and of course I said like, hey, can I quote you on that? And he was like, hey, don't get me in trouble. But like that gave me the motivation to go out and raise again. And all of a sudden we started getting like verbals, and verbals turned into term sheets. So notice that's 2 very different points of validation. One was technical validation. One was actually talking to somebody. The last one I didn't mention is customer validation. In that same way of us going into a customer and saying, let me test for free. Don't go in with the slick pitches and just say, let me show you value. And then actually have them come back and saying, I see the value. That type of validation, again, if you can't figure out, I would say those 3 independent places. If you're raising money, you need to be able to show the technology works. That can happen through cute NSA hacking things, right? Or customer validation. I had both. And then when I had somebody who was like, I was pitching and had a true VC that took the time with me and their busy schedule to get my pitch right, only when I had that trifecta of validation was I able to tell my story confidently. And Ernie, I think I failed to raise over a year. Like even my first term sheets, we turned down in Series A and came back, raised a bridge round, and had to come back like a year later to raise a proper Series A. So I just hope that gives confidence to the people that listen to this of like, you can have success on the outside, but nobody hears all the failure internally that comes way before any of that brief moment of congratulations, Forgepoint writes you a term sheet. Like there was so much more failure that happened behind the scenes that although it looked great externally, internally, there was a lot more drops than there were peaks, right? A lot more valleys than peaks.
Yeah, and I think one of the to sum that up, that the lessons are, it's a repetitive process. There's going to be failures, but the net result is success and coachability and being able to learn. So that's what you proved. Let's move forward now to more present day. So when we first met, September of 2019, it was clear you had a vision. The go-to-market was working. You had 18 employees. This was pre-Marcos, right? He was the 19th employee, and he had maybe 4 million of ARR, which was a good amount for a pre-Series A company. Fast forward to today, you've raised over 160 million, 300 employees, 4,000 plus channel partners, over 100,000 supported small business and medium businesses, and you're protecting, 2.3, 2.5 million endpoints. So amazing, overnight success in 8 years. Amazing traction. But one of the things I've had the front row seat on is seeing how the execution has been implemented to a very high degree and how the culture of the company has grown and become very unique. I spent 3 days with you this summer and the entire team down in LA at your all
Summer Summit. Yeah.
Summer Summit. So talk about the execution and building a culture, because I think, put all the technical components aside, talk about how important those are and how you build those.
So early stage entrepreneur, when you wrote me my very first Series A, term sheet on that end, Ernie, I would not have heard something that you just said. And so I want to double down. If you are not coachable and can't establish a feedback loop where you constantly fail into success, ideally though, don't fail into success, succeed in there. What I mean by that is everybody says fail fast, fail often. If you spend all your day failing, you're not going to spend your time executing. So for me, coaching and getting great founders, great external voices, at the same time knowing when to put your earmuffs on and not listen. Sometimes people have bad advice and that's hard to find out. But for me, I look at Ernie as almost a corkscrew, because it's not just a circle. If you're not progressing forward in that corkscrew, you will not make it. And so what I mean by this is like the team of me, Chris and John as founders, we were strong. But I had no clue that whole team matters would actually be the probably steel thread that ran through our execution. So Ernie dropped the name earlier, Marcos Torres. I pitched this guy on LinkedIn. I needed a finance and operations leader. I wouldn't realize that he would play a role in the last 5 years that was so significant that it's on par with an early stage founder. He's been that critical. And you just don't know. But what happens when you actually hire great people, and I'm not saying I've got the recipe for great people, but truly the difference of what a lot of people can't tell is that Steve Jobs uses that A player, B player. I still don't know what the recipe for that is. But when you find an A player who can grow with you, you'll play off each other's strengths and you'll complement each other's weaknesses. And so for Ernie, for me, I mean, you just threw out like some of the coolest KPIs for me to just listen. I was grinning from ear to ear. But we had to earn every single one of those. So for instance, having achievable goals and being able to keep yourself, like half of this game as a founder or even just an executive leadership team is not burning yourself out and keeping your mind like mentally healthy. Like I just recently penned, Ernie, on how my CEO role has been both the most fulfilling and lonely job I've ever had. What keeps me from going over that edge has been reminding myself and great other people who will pick up the slack when I can't. Like you can't operate at 110% all the time. You'll burn out. And so for me, Ernie, by hiring those great early players, my first, again, Marcos was offered a director of finance role, came on board as a VP of finance and operations, grew into that all the way to the point he's now my CFO. Marcos of 2023, 2024 is not the same Marcos of 2020. Like it's not even the same guy. You couldn't even recognize him. So he had to grow too. But sometimes, Ernie, the biggest thing on operations and getting alignment and making sure that we had a process to set achievable goals and keep our morale high, sometimes was acknowledging and having a culture that calls out like, not everybody can make it to the finish line. And if you're not having that hard conversation with somebody when you hire them, notice that it's telling somebody about their future potential termination when you hire them. You're going to really struggle to up level. And by me doing that, my most consequential sales leader in my entire company turned out to be my first VP of sales that I kind of didn't have the conversation with him. He brought me my first $1 million, which was so much harder. And it turned out, even though he was consequential, the most consequential sales leader, I didn't have the conversation that one day he might be hired over. And it turns out the most effective sales leader I hired was my second VP of sales. And when the first guy got that demotion and had to become something underneath the next VP of sales, he left. It hurt his, ego. He wasn't prepared for it. And I failed as a CEO by preparing him that one day somebody might have to step over him. Obviously, it's worked out. That most influential or consequential sales leader, Andrew, is still with me today. We've been on this journey 5+ years, and he's brought me from 1.5 million in revenue to over 70 million in revenue, even hiring his own boss. But the reason he's still here making a difference 5 years later is because I started and I had a process and we were aligned. So I know I threw a lot of things. So maybe to give that in summary, Ernie, I would say team matters. Do whatever you can to truly bring in A players. Bring them in at the right time. Be transparent and set them up for success, and then have achievable goals that keep morale high and just go from one goal to the next, to the next, to the next, and have those good entrepreneurs giving you feedback and be coachable. Because if you are not going to level up, you will have to level out as a founder, and that's just real.
Great advice. Switching gears a little, within cybersecurity, we have point solutions and platforms. And they play different parts in the ecosystem. When we invested, your vision was clearly to build a platform, multiple SKUs. But the reality is it was a point solution in the beginning. Fast forward today, it is a robust platform. But, as someone building it, talk about some of the nuances, some of the difficulties of building those multiple SKUs and scaling a platform where you can go to a customer and say, hey, we're going to sign you up with this SKU, but we want you to be on these 3, 4, 5 SKUs and kind of expand to those.
So the general rule of thumb from all the high scale entrepreneurs I know that make it past, call it 50 million in recurring revenue or above 100, They'll tell me, generally speaking, if you try to go for the SMB, you're going to be capped somewhere at about 100 million in recurring revenue on one single product, which is a lot. Let's be real. That's a lot of revenue. Most people never see that. But if you think about what's at risk for a company like Huntress, I have millions of small and mid-sized businesses who need me to deliver, call it world-class cybersecurity expertise for the price of a product. But they need me to figure out where to start first. And where I see most entrepreneurs get it wrong is they try to build a platform too early. So one thing that helped in my pitch, Ernie, in my opinion, especially when it came to Series B and Series C, I was pitching it will be a platform, or it is a platform, and where it could go. But I think sometimes founders forget you got to start somewhere. So Huntress started as a single capability. Most would have called it a feature. But we found somebody who was willing to pay for it to get started. And then I built many capabilities into what I would call a product. And then I raised my prices 40% because it made sense. They had so much value that we were able to retain the vast majority of our partners because I delivered so much value and my gross margin was hurting. We did a price increase. And then what happens is now once you have one product, you start listening to those customers and they will literally tell you if they need more product. And sometimes you got to be able to hear what they say and interpret it. And where I'm going is if from the beginning you are not thinking, how does this get bigger? Meaning like if you want to go beyond 100 million in revenue, assuming you can even get there, you probably need multiple products to help you get there. And Ernie, I'm going to be real with your audience, like getting one great product and capturing lightning in a bottle is almost impossible. Capturing lightning in a bottle multiple times sounds crazy, but what happens is you learn from your earlier lessons to build a product. And so for us, Ernie, I had to think things through where a platform meant not only just being able to have one product, but remember, those small and mid-sized businesses have many cybersecurity problems. So now, because I built from the beginning with infrastructure that allowed these products to, again, correlate data, talk together, work together where 1 + 1 equaled more than 2, it's a really compelling pitch for someone to say, oh, wait, I can just give you a couple bucks more and now I get way more value and I don't have to hire people and I'm able to get this. Like, it's a big win. And so Ernie, to this day, like Huntress, I mentioned, crossing over 70 million in revenue. We actually grow more in expansion through cross-sell and growing with our partners than we do in new logos. They still pace each other fairly close, but where I'm going is it just gives you more opportunities to succeed. And the lessons you learned from the hardest days of the company of like going from a seed company to A company to a B, they tend to become different, in many ways easier to capture lightning multiple times. So I will double down that if you want to be truly an independent company of consequence, you probably will have to become a platform, or sometimes they use the word ecosystem. And if you don't start thinking about that years ahead of the time, one, you're not going to get the credit from your both customers or your entrepreneurs, or by entrepreneurs, I mean other people you're trying to hire, or VC, that you have a big vision. And two, if you come to that conclusion, you need a platform too late, someone will beat you to it. And it's very hard to start and work backwards to build a platform. So I know I threw a lot in that statement, but for me, Ernie, having the vision in the beginning, but achieving small, bite-sized pieces, just like you eat an elephant one bite at a time, helped me grow into this point now that I have a very robust platform where we're talking about how do I go from 3 products, in the next handful of years, it could be 10. And that doesn't happen overnight.
Well, I think that's a great example of having a vision and then executing against that through multiple years, multiple iterations. When we invested in 2019, which, wasn't that long ago, but it was in the post-pandemic world, it seems like a long time. Supporting, protecting the SMB wasn't obvious. It was obvious to you, Chris and John, but to the rest of the world, it wasn't obvious, even with the increase in ransomware, which, for some people came out of nowhere, but it certainly has become obvious. So the point I'm getting at here is competition. With the obviousness of the market comes more competition. So how do you think about competition? How do you think about that addressable market? Because, like you guys say, you're protecting the 99%. there's a lot of small businesses, whether it's in the US, North America, Europe, Asia, you name it. So how do you think about competition and your overall TAM?
So total addressable market for any market should be very, very big. If not, why are you building a SaaS platform for it? So let's call that out. But knowing where to start and where to get what I would call a beachhead, or as a hacker from NSA, I would probably say a foothold into the market, sometimes means you might have those big lofty platform ambitions, but if you don't carve out that beachhead, someone is going to displace you, whether it's an incumbent vendor who's doing something not related to you, but has the customer base already and can maybe build something like yours. Or in our case, it was enterprise companies trying to come downwards. And so, Ernie, I think one of the successes that we purposely did was we started narrow. We went after North American service providers, which are often MSPs, MSSPs, value-added resellers, telcos, things like that. And by staying very narrow on that vertical and going after those customers and building something that they wanted and made them money that was just only on the endpoint, I was able to really not only build my credibility, but I was able to build their trust. And once I had their trust, because what happens is like, that's what's called first mover advantage. I was first and I was early and it was really hard, but I built trust. The problem is second mover advantage is also a thing. And people can come on and say, I do everything that Huntress does plus this. And even if it's not accurate, if you don't have that deeply rooted trust, there's a really big advantage. And maybe if you haven't thought about it, if you're thinking about building a company, there's benefits of being second, right? If you look at Apple, especially the iPhone, in many cases now, Samsung builds things for their phones first, the Galaxy series, and then Apple comes in with their second version of it that usually is a bit more stable, a bit more friendly, and as a result, iPhone still rules the market. And so where I'm going is, we had to do both. In some places, we had to figure out where did we want to be first mover to build trust, and that's how it happens, being that mover and shaker. But we also were very deliberate in some cases and said, let's watch this develop a little bit further. Let's keep it in mind with small R&D efforts on the technical side. And as we're learning about other people having success, let's consider being a very close second mover, meaning we're almost like a 1.5 mover, meaning we were the first, but we didn't wait for everybody else to catch up. And for us, that's helped us keep very lean and ahead of the pack. But I will be honest, Ernie, you're seeing it with me in the boardrooms. Everybody now wants to come after the small and mid-sized businesses. The small vendors in cybersecurity are trying to go up market. The enterprise players are trying to come down, and the incumbents who did nothing related to cybersecurity are trying to come over. And if I didn't have that foothold, if I didn't have that trust, and if I didn't show them that I could also move quick and be, a second mover when needed, I think Huntress would be probably acquired already. We wouldn't have been able to have the success, and we would have been like most companies that aren't able to become public companies of consequence.
You alluded to the board. You've successfully raised money from top VCs. You have Forgepoint, you have Gula Tech, you have JMI, you have Sapphire. And the board's gotten bigger. We just brought on Myrna Soto as an independent. Help some of the founders, the CEOs out there understand some of, how you manage expectations of a board and how you do it formally and informally, because there's a lot of, we were texting this morning, there's the informal piece and then there's the formality. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I'm going to start with maybe what could be bad advice, but it's a dynamic, Ernie. I've discovered, I haven't found a book in it, but I'm going to call it out anyway. I did not realize that, but in my experience, most boards and executive leadership teams have a more adversarial relationship than I personally believe is healthy. And a lot of times, Ernie, I call that, like when I'm talking to my team about it, I think a lot of people carry old baggage from bad boards. And by default, many executive leadership teams don't feel comfortable. Don't feel comfortable oversharing, don't feel comfortable of what's the board's idea. Mm-hmm. I think that's a toxic, I will use that word and I mean it wholeheartedly, a toxic idea. And what I mean by this is, like, from the beginning, Ernie, I spend more time qualifying like capital will come if you have a good product. Like when you and I got together, from the beginning, I thought, can I work with Ernie? Not when things are good, but what is it like working with Ernie when things are at its worst, right? Because unlike like a marriage, right, that you can get a divorce and you can move away from your partner or spouse, you cannot move away from, a partner when you take capital that way. We're together. We're in this together. And since we can't just divorce, you really better make sure you like that person, and not when everything's going good, when they're in their darkest, gloomiest moments. And so for me, I spent so much time, Ernie, not only learning about you, your background as a fighter pilot, but also like you were still hustling and growing in your career too, that you could go on this journey with me. That meant a lot. And then it was about your fund, right, and your firm. And so making sure like, okay, well, there's enough money at Forgepoint, right? They had a good fund that I'm not going to have to worry, like, are they going to run out of money? Are they going to go away? And I did that same thing to JMI. We were the first money out of their Fund 10. Casper, we were some of the very early money out of their, $1 billion plus fund. And so we truly, I would say, Ernie, all of this starts with, can you work with these people? And I don't mean just like have a formal and informal conversation. Do you want to work with them? The other one, Ernie, and I think you've seen it for me, I believe in radical candor and transparency, like the type of transparency that makes most founders and companies uncomfortable. And even to this day, Ernie, believe it or not, at my current stage, I have some ELT that are like, are you sure you want to share that with your board? And I have to even overcome at, to the point where 300 employees, where I have to say, the board is only there to help us and they're in this together. But I think, Ernie, where I'm going with this last bit of feedback is your board dynamic should be bringing on people that are a lot like both friends and grandparent relationships. They are not there to be your parent. They are not an adversary. And it's different. If you have done a poor job, and sometimes you just have to, if you need capital so desperately, you have to manage that expectation of when is it friendship time and when is it grandparent time. And sometimes there's middle ground. And where I'm going with that, Ernie, is I think that has allowed me that when I need to be informal with you, I can BS and say, this is where we screwed this up, or this is how we did it. And I could admit that. And usually you're like, oh, I've done something like this before. Let me tell you about this. If you see me really messing up, you are able to connect me with the resources. JMI and Sapphire have been excellent about getting me like entrepreneurs that are later stage too to help me like learn these lessons. And I don't have to worry about like, are you going to fire me? That's not something I've ever worried about on my end, not one time. And even when things aren't going good, COVID, that was a bad year, right? That was a really bad year when SMBs were crushed. I never worried about my job one time with you because I knew I had somebody that when I needed it could be a friend, and when I need it would hold me accountable like a grandparent, right? And you'd be firm, right? Grandparents aren't going to let their grandkids do silly stuff. And so my advice would be, if you have those things that I mentioned and you truly interview your partners, and they're interviewing you, by the way, and you're truly being upfront, you can be radically candor and transparent. And what happens is I have to wear two hats. Sometimes with Ernie, I am in a casual friend relationship and we're talking like casual friends. And when it comes time for us to vote, I'm calling our meeting to order and I'm asking in the most formal ways, all opposed, say, aye, or all in favor, say aye, all opposed, say nay. And we have to get strict and responsible, and we're different people. I just don't think anybody thinks that far ahead. Once you already propose and you put a ring on somebody, like there's no going back. So Ernie, my advice on this one is entrepreneurs and investors, interview your founders, interview your investors back and forth, and understand what you're getting yourself into. If you're not willing to have somebody and go through the worst days with somebody, like you're making a wrong decision. And so I know that's black and white in my opinion, but Ernie, our board is the most functional board I've run across. I'm sure there's better ones. There's always something better. But you guys have been great, and I hope I've been equally great by pushing that envelope and doing things different than most entrepreneurs.
It's a very functional board, and I've not heard the friend-grandparent analogy. I like that one. I haven't thought about that, but let's move on to threat landscape. One of the things that has made Huntress very successful is the amount of automation John, Roger, and others have brought to the team. Now the threat landscape has evolved to now Gen I is front and center, it can help defenders. It can also help offenders. So how are you guys thinking through? It's just another massive variable in the threat landscape. How are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I'm going to set the backdrop with, like, let's think about what small and mid-sized businesses have just gone through in 3 years. Everybody has some form of work from home, so they've gone remote since 2020. At the same time, their on-premise, applications have now moved to SaaS applications, mass digital transformation. At the same time, generative AI, the chat GPTs, the open AIs, et cetera, are bringing a new form, leveling up what was already great with machine learning, neural networks on that end. And now we have another form of accessibility. The whole landscape has just changed out from under all mid-sized and small businesses. And the ones that are thriving are the ones that are figuring out a way to adopt this. And the ones that are starting to, I would call, separate, right? Usually go down are the people who are not. So that's the backdrop to this question. Now, Ernie, on this end, like, we've always been about, I call it obsessive and excessive. Those are two different words, but we use automation everywhere we can because I have to bring a $300,000 to $400,000 a year top quality cybersecurity researcher and deliver them for $2, $3 per computer, $2, $3 per identity per month. That is really hard. And so where I'm going with this is Huntress has found a way from the beginning that we have to stay ahead of automation. And sometimes automation just means, how do you store your data? And how do you tag your data and classify it? And sometimes you can use very, very fancy ML and use K nearest neighbor, whatever the fancy buzzword algorithm is today. And sometimes you can just get away with, I'm going to automate 80% of that problem. And that remaining 20%, I'm going to use a really smart human brain. So for us, it's been that, not just using endless automation, because automation can be expensive too. How do you use the right level of automation and then complement it with humans? And what sucks is hackers are doing the exact same thing, Ernie. On the offensive side, we're seeing phishing emails become overnight up-leveled with better, Gen AI, Chat GPT type templates that are beautiful, that are really, really sophisticated. We're seeing also code where some of the people, for instance, we're not seeing people become super hackers. I'm not seeing script kiddies become nation state actors overnight, but I am now seeing script kiddies where the world of creating offensive software in some places has been democratized because they're now having these generative technology build them capabilities like a keystroke logger, build them capabilities to mass download or mass encrypt files. And what's happened is now the bar is completely different. And if we don't keep ahead of that on the, I would say maybe taking an offensive approach to our defense and think like a hacker ahead of time and use this offense first, we will be caught off guard. And just like those SMBs who are not using all this digital transformation to their advantage, we will have the risk that in cybersecurity that we could be just caught flat-footed enough that it's a risk to our business. So Ernie, summarizing that up, it's saying these new trends don't happen every day, but they sure as heck are happening faster than they used to. And with those three industry-changing things happening in the last 3 years alone, you could imagine companies like ours, we aren't just, reinvesting a little bit into R&D. I've had to raise capital, Ernie, specifically to fund my R&D to stay ahead of this and do it in an economical fashion. So I couldn't just blindly spend cash, but it takes money to make money. It takes money to protect. And so if you're a type of founder who's considering, can I bootstrap this to the end? My suggestion would be, you better be using automation. And if you're going to keep that lead, you better have, sadly, some financial coffers behind you to help you stay ahead. If not, you'll be eclipsed by the, changing tides.
So we're going to wrap this up. And it has been amazing advice for any of those founders out there listening. I'm sure it's been a treasure trove of advice here. But I want to end with one last question. So I already alluded to when we first met, and it was clear Kyle had a vision, right? And it's been hard work, execution, trials and tribulations, but over the years, but a net amazing outcome to where you are now. When you think 2, 3, 5 years into the future, where do you see Huntress? Let me leave it there for you.
You know, the financial analyst, Ernie, asks me the question usually directly, are you going to IPO? And I always give him the answer, Ernie, that IPO for me is all about optionality, but think about what that means. I have 100,000+ businesses secured of 30+ million in the US alone. We haven't even started to, we're nowhere close to completing our mission, right? So for me, the next 3 years are about being a, again, sustained, independent company of consequence. And by independent, I mean somebody that's building for public shareholders. But that doesn't mean I have to be public, Ernie. And more specific than that, I'm more worried about how do I secure SMBs. So while in these board meetings that you and I are in, I tell you, hey, Ernie, here's how I'm going to go from 70 million in revenue, and I'm going to grow no less than 60-70% in the following year. Internally, we rally behind how do we protect more small and mid-sized businesses. And every KPI that we use internally is about measuring that if we secure X number of businesses, we will then have Y number of revenue, and they directly align. And so for me, the next 3 years are about how do I build more product? How do I deliver that product at a margin that makes sense for my small and mid-sized businesses, but still allows me to grow? And that's a perpetual feedback loop. That's the Huntress virtuous cycle. Deliver awesome things that make a difference to the SMB. With the revenue and profit that I make from that, reinvest it into new technology that will then again secure SMBs, that then allow us to build new products, that then allow us to chase down hackers, to make more money, and it just feeds in and in. And as I add more customers, more SMBs, I just get more effective. And so, Ernie, the only thing on my mind from here to the next 3 years and beyond is how do I secure the 99% of small and mid-sized businesses?
Well, said very well. I think I summed that up in you have a mission. Mission matters to you, and your mission from day one has been securing the SMB, and that's what you'll continue to do. And the cards will fall where they may, but I think you articulated that very well.
You've got a shirt that says it on there right there. At the front of your shirt says "Hacker's gonna hack," and the back of the shirt says "Huntress gonna hunt," and that's exactly what we're gonna do.
And that's kind of the OODA loop that keeps going. But hey, Kyle, thanks again for your friendship, your leadership, your commitment to protecting the SMB, and everything you've done for the community. So thanks for taking the time today, and all the best to you, John and Chris, in the future.
Awesome, man. And likewise, thanks for believing us, when no one else did. And likewise, thanks for growing on this journey with me. I think some people forget that, great journeys, right? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So thanks for coming with me.
You bet. It's been a blast. Thanks, Kyle.
All right, brother. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Subscribe to the Forgecast, which is brought to you by Forgepoint Capital. We're a leading cybersecurity and digital infrastructure venture capital firm that invests in exceptional teams protecting the digital future. To learn more about Forgepoint, visit forgepointcap.com or find us on LinkedIn and Twitter.